The branch was quiet in the particular way banks are quiet on a Tuesday morning, the kind of hush built from carpet and low ceilings and the hum of a copier nobody was using. A radio somewhere behind the teller line played something soft and forgettable, the kind of song designed to be background and nothing more, and the air smelled faintly of the burnt coffee sitting untouched on the warming plate near the door. Marcus stood at the counter with his hands folded in front of him, and even folded, even still, his hands looked like they belonged to someone who could end an argument without raising them. He was the tallest thing in the room by a foot, and he knew it, and he had stopped letting that knowledge change how he stood a long time ago. The teller had asked him to wait. Then a second employee had asked him to wait somewhere else, gesturing toward a spot near the pillar as if the extra 10 feet of distance might make whatever came next easier for everyone but him. Now Gerald Finch, branch manager, mid-50s, tie a half-inch too tight, was walking toward him with a folder held against his chest like a shield. "Mr. Renner," Gerald said, and his voice had the practiced calm of a man who had delivered bad news enough times to have smoothed the edges off it, "I'm going to need to place a temporary hold on your account. Pending review." Marcus didn't move. He didn't ask why. Not yet, not because he didn't want to know, but because he had learned that the first question rarely got the real answer, and that patience, more often than people expected, was the sharpest question of all. Somewhere behind him, near the platform desks, a small woman in a plain gray blazer kept signing a stack of papers without looking up, her pen moving in short, unhurried strokes. And nobody in that room was watching her. Nobody had watched her for 11 days. That was their first mistake. If this is the kind of story you need right now, subscribe. There's more coming. Marcus's morning had started 6 hours earlier, in a hospital that never fully went dark. He had been on his feet since 4, moving through the ICU with the specific quiet of someone who had learned, over many years, that panic helps no one and stillness saves lives. A nurse half his height had jogged to keep up with him at one point, relaying vitals on a patient in bed 14, and he had listened without breaking stride, nodded once, adjusted a dosage with 2 words, and kept walking. A first-year resident had once asked him, half joking, whether he ever raised his voice during a code, and Marcus had told her, without a trace of humor, that the loudest room he'd ever worked in was the one where he'd made the most mistakes, and he had never let a room get that loud again. Nobody in that hallway asked what right he had to be there. Nobody in that hallway looked at his size and flinched. But that was the hospital, a building where his hands had a title attached to them, where 30 years of context walked in the door before he did. Outside those walls, he carried none of that context with him, and he had made his peace with it before he turned 30. Back when he still sometimes tried to explain himself to strangers who hadn't asked and never fully believed him anyway. This morning, before his shift ended, he had signed off on a discharge, checked in on a resident who was still shaking from her first code blue, and told her, in 4 words, that she'd done fine. He'd stopped by the family waiting room on his way out, too, the way he almost always did, to tell an elderly couple that their son was stable, and the husband had gripped Marcus's hand with both of his own and hadn't wanted to let go, and Marcus had simply stood there and let him hold on for as long as he needed to. Then he had gone home, showered, put on the plainest clothes he owned, a gray t-shirt, worn jeans, a jacket with a tear at the cuff he had never bothered to fix, and driven to the bank to deposit a check before an early flight to a conference where 300 people would stand up when he walked into the room. He liked this hour of the day precisely because no one here would stand up for him. He liked being unremarkable. It was the only kind of rest he ever really got, the only stretch of any given week where nobody needed anything from him at all, where he could stand in a line like anyone else and think about nothing more urgent than whether he'd left the stove on. What none of them could see, and what he had never once explained to a stranger, was that his eyes moved faster than most people's when he read, not nervous, not evasive, just trained, the way a surgeon's hands stay trained long after the last operation, scanning a document the way he'd once scanned a chart, looking for the one number that didn't belong. He had picked up the same habit for faces without meaning to, could read a room in the time it took most people to find a seat in it, could tell, usually within a few seconds, who in a given crowd was frightened and who was merely uncomfortable and who was dangerous. A skill that had saved lives more than once and had never once been used for his own benefit. He noticed things. He simply chose, almost every day of his life, to do nothing with what he noticed, because doing something, for a man his size, so often cost more than staying still. Claire had woken up 2 hours before Marcus finished his shift, in an apartment 3 blocks from the branch, and she had made her coffee standing on a step stool she kept by the counter for exactly that purpose and no other, because she refused to keep one anywhere else in the kitchen. She was 38 years old, 4'3", and she had spent every year since she was old enough to understand the word small watching people decide who she was before she said a single sentence. She used to correct them. She used to explain, patiently, again and again, in classrooms and courtrooms and grocery store lines, laying out the facts of her own competence as though competence were something that needed to be argued for. At some point in her 30s she had simply stopped, because she'd realized the explaining was a kind of performance too, a way of asking for permission she didn't actually need, and permission she'd decided was not something she was in the business of requesting anymore. Now she let people be wrong about her for as long as it took them to be useful to her, or for as long as it took her to decide they weren't worth the correction at all. She dressed plainly on purpose most days, a gray blazer, flat shoes, nothing that asked for attention, because she had learned that being underestimated was, more often than not, the sharpest tool she owned. Sharper than any argument she could have made standing up straight and demanding to be taken seriously. This morning she carried a small leather notebook in her bag, the kind with a worn brass clasp gone soft at the hinge from years of opening and closing, and inside it she had been writing things down for 3 weeks that she had shown to exactly no one. Not her assistant, not her supervisor at the regional office. Nobody. She had a habit, when she was working something through, of writing in short fragments rather than full sentences, phrases that would mean nothing to anyone but her, a name, a date, a discrepancy of $11 that had led her to a discrepancy of 11,000, and beneath that, in handwriting so small it was nearly illegible, a single word she had underlined twice: pattern. She had learned, over a decade in this line of work, that people who caused the most damage rarely looked like the danger they were, that they wore ties and said ma'am and believed most of the time that they were the ones protecting everyone else. What the tellers at this branch saw, when they saw her at all, was a soft-spoken woman filling out paperwork at the platform desk, unremarkable, patient, the kind of customer who didn't need to be rushed, who said thank you to everyone and asked for nothing twice. What they didn't know, what she had specifically arranged for them not to know, not yet, was that she had been placed at this branch 11 days ago by the Regional Fraud Division, and that the account she was quietly building a case around belonged to a man who worked 2 desks away from where she sat, close enough that she had listened to him clear his throat every morning at exactly 9:15, close enough that she had learned the particular rhythm of his footsteps before she had ever needed to know his name. Gerald Finch had not always been a man who enjoyed telling people bad news. He had started at this branch 19 years ago as a teller, 23 years old and eager in a way he would later find almost embarrassing to remember. And he still recalled, with an embarrassing clarity, the first time a supervisor had pulled him aside for being too lenient, for waving through a transaction that should have been flagged, for trusting a smile over a signature. 6 months later, that leniency had cost the branch $11,000 in a fraud case that made it all the way to a regional review, and his name had been in the file, not as the perpetrator, but as the man who hadn't looked closely enough. He had never forgotten the feeling of sitting across from his district manager and hearing, very calmly, that trust was not a banking policy, that a good heart was not a compliance strategy, and that he would need to decide going forward what kind of employee he wanted to be. Since that day he had built himself into precisely the opposite of the young man who'd been in that room. He followed protocol the way other men followed scripture, memorized the thresholds, read every compliance memo twice, and told himself, more often than he probably needed to, that vigilance was simply another word for care. He flagged anything that felt even slightly irregular, and he had trained himself not to feel guilty about it, because guilt, he told himself, was what got people fired. He had a wife who managed a dental office across town, and came home most nights too tired to talk about her day, and two kids in a public high school who were, at this exact moment, more interested in college applications than in anything happening at their father's branch. A mortgage he'd refinanced twice just to keep the payments manageable, and a corporate quota this quarter that had already cost one of his colleagues her job for missing it by a margin so small it had felt, to everyone who'd watched it happen, almost cruel. He was not, by any honest account, a cruel man. He tipped well. He remembered the names of regular customers' children. He had once stayed 40 minutes past closing to help an elderly widow untangle a wire transfer that had gone to the wrong account, and he had never once mentioned it to anyone, because he hadn't done it to be seen doing it. When Marcus's account had triggered an automated flag that morning, a pattern of transfers that looked on paper exactly like a dozen fraud cases Gerald had read about in the last compliance memo, he had not thought about the size of the man standing at his counter, or the color of his skin, not consciously, not in words he would have said out loud or even fully admitted to himself. He would have told you, if you'd asked him directly, that he was only doing his job, that the system had flagged the account and he was simply the one delivering the message. He believed that. That was what made it worse. Somewhere underneath the protocol, in the part of him he never examined too closely, in the part he would have sworn under oath didn't exist, was a version of the same old story. A big man, a raised voice waiting to happen, a threat to be managed before it became a problem. And Gerald had let that unexamined feeling walk in half a step ahead of the actual data, choosing to deliver this particular hold in person, at the counter, in front of other customers, when a phone call or a letter would have done exactly as well for anyone he wasn't a little afraid of. He would not have called it fear, he would have called it caution. That, more than anything else, was the whole shape of the problem. "I don't have anything irregular in my account," Marcus said, and his voice was low and even. The same voice he used to tell a frightened patient's family that surgery had gone as expected. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't performing calm the way some men did, jaw tight, words clipped to hide the anger underneath. He was simply calm, the way he was almost always calm, because he had learned decades ago that his size turned other people's fear into a kind of weather he had to manage, and raising his voice, even in complete innocence, only ever made the storm worse. "There's a hold," Gerald repeated, and he opened the folder as if the paper inside it could do the explaining for him, "until the review clears. It's a standard flag. I'd ask you not to make this difficult." Marcus hadn't moved a muscle. He hadn't leaned forward, hadn't raised a hand, hadn't done anything that could be mistaken, by even the most anxious observer, for a threat. And still Gerald took half a step back as he said it, and a man in line behind Marcus quietly shifted his weight toward the door, and a young teller near the counter reached, almost without thinking, for the phone on her desk. None of them could have told you exactly why. That was the part that would sit with all of them later, once they understood what they'd actually been watching. Claire's pen stopped moving. She didn't look up yet, but she was listening now, and she had stopped writing fragments and started, very deliberately, writing down the time. "Sir, I'll need you to step aside so I can help the next customer," Gerald said, and something in the room seemed to tighten, the way air tightens right before a summer storm breaks. It should have ended there. It didn't. A second employee, younger, more nervous than Gerald, appeared at his shoulder and said the word security, quietly enough that it was almost a question, and that was the moment the floor seemed to drop out from under something that had, until then, simply been a bureaucratic inconvenience. Marcus still hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't raised anything, he said. "I'd like to understand what triggered the review," in the same measured tone he'd used since the beginning, and it was the reasonableness of it, the sheer, unbothered patience of a man being treated like a threat, that made the whole scene feel unbearable to the dozen people now quietly watching from the platform desks and the line at the counter. A woman near the door had her phone half raised, not filming yet, just ready. An older man in a cardigan had stopped pretending to read a brochure. A young father with a toddler on his hip had angled his body slightly, instinctively, putting himself between his son and whatever he thought might happen next, though nothing about Marcus had given him any actual reason to. Nobody in that line said a word in his defense. That was its own kind of quiet Marcus had felt 100 times before. The particular silence of a room deciding, without discussing it, to wait and see rather than to speak up. And he had long since stopped expecting anything different, though it never stopped costing him something small every time it happened. And Claire, still seated, still holding her pen, had not moved either, because she wasn't ready yet, not because she couldn't be. Gerald, feeling the eyes of the room and mistaking the silence for escalation rather than restraint, said the thing that would follow him for the rest of his career. "I don't want this to turn into a situation." He said it like a warning. He meant it like one. And it was that sentence, not the hold, not the folder, not even the word security, that made Claire finally set her pen down and stand up from her chair, the sound of her flat shoes against the marble floor small and unhurried and, somehow, in that room, louder than anything anyone had said in the last 3 minutes. She crossed the floor without rushing, and she came up to stand, not beside Marcus exactly, but near enough that the geometry of the confrontation changed the second she arrived, a woman just over 4 feet tall inserting herself into a standoff between a man well over 6, and Gerald actually laughed. A short, surprised sound he would later be deeply ashamed of, because it was the laugh of someone who had decided, in half a second, that whatever was happening here couldn't possibly need him to take this new arrival seriously. "Can I help you?" he asked, and the "you" carried an edge he probably didn't even hear himself. Claire looked at him, and there was that half-second pause she always took before speaking, the pause that made people lean in without knowing why they were leaning. "I'd like you to explain the review criteria you used to flag this account," she said, and her voice was soft, unhurried, entirely without heat, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. "And I'd like you to say it clearly enough that everyone standing here can hear you." Gerald blinked. "And you are?" he said, and there was that smile again, small, condescending, the smile of a man who had already decided the answer wouldn't matter. "I'm someone who's been sitting 15 feet from you for the last hour," Claire said, "filling out paperwork you didn't once ask me about." It wasn't an answer. It wasn't meant to be, not yet. Gerald's smile thinned but held. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," he said, and reached for the folder again, as though the conversation could simply be closed by the act of closing a folder, and that was the moment the room's second false floor gave way, because instead of backing off, Gerald doubled down, raising his voice for the first time, telling the small crowd that had gathered to please step back and let bank staff handle this, as if the size of the crowd, rather than the thinness of his justification, was the actual problem. A second security guard had appeared near the entrance now, drawn by whatever the first nervous employee had radioed, and he stood there uncertainly, clearly unsure whether the situation in front of him called for anything at all, which was, in its own way, exactly the problem, that a room full of adults could sense something was wrong and still not agree on what to do about it. Claire didn't raise her voice to match Gerald's. She didn't need to. She simply reached into her bag, unclasped the small leather notebook she'd been writing in for 3 weeks, and turned to a page near the back, and the sound of the pages turning, soft as it was, seemed to carry further in that room than Gerald's raised voice had a moment earlier. The call came before she said a word. Claire's phone buzzed once in her blazer pocket, and she glanced at it, and something in her face changed. Not surprise, more like confirmation, the look of someone watching a puzzle complete itself exactly on schedule. She held the phone up, not to her ear but towards Gerald, the screen angled so he could see the name on it. A regional compliance director whose name, it turned out, Gerald had emailed exactly 4 times in the last 2 years, always with the word urgent in the subject line. "This is going to answer your question better than I can," Claire said, and put the phone to her ear instead, said "yes, he's right here" into it, and held it out towards Gerald, who took it with the slow, dawning dread of a man watching a door open onto a room he'd never meant to walk into. The voice on the other end spoke for maybe 45 seconds. Gerald's face changed twice in that time, first the color draining from it, then a kind of stiffness settling into his jaw, the particular stillness of someone doing frantic math in his head and not liking any of the answers. He handed the phone back to Claire without a word. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of the authority it carried 30 seconds earlier. "I didn't realize." "No," Claire agreed, "you didn't." She hadn't raised her voice once. She still hadn't. That was, somehow, the most unsettling part of the whole thing, that she had dismantled him with the same unhurried patience she'd used to fill out paperwork an hour earlier. The regional office had assigned Claire to this branch 11 days prior, not to investigate customers, but to investigate a manager whose pattern of selectively aggressive reviews had, over the past year, disproportionately targeted a specific kind of customer, men who looked a certain way, in a pattern too consistent to be coincidence and too quiet to have been caught any other way, and the account she'd been building her case around from the platform desk, the transfers she'd flagged in her small leather notebook 11 days ago, belonged not to Marcus at all, but to Gerald Finch himself, and the irregularities that had triggered Marcus's hold that morning were, as it turned out, an automated system Gerald had personally recalibrated 6 months earlier, tightening its thresholds around the exact demographic profile that made him, on some level he had never once examined out loud, uneasy. Marcus watched all of this happen without moving, without so much as shifting his weight. And it was only when Gerald handed the phone back to Claire, visibly smaller now than he had been 3 minutes ago, though he hadn't lost an inch of height, that Marcus finally turned his head, just slightly, and looked at her. She didn't look back at him. Her eyes stayed on Gerald, steady, unblinking, giving him the full weight of her attention in a way that felt, to everyone watching, like the opposite of mercy. "The hold on Mr. Renner's account will be released within the hour," Claire said, still to Gerald, still without raising her voice. "And you'll be hearing from compliance about the pattern in your review logs going back 14 months. I'd suggest you use today to think about which part of that conversation you'd like to have first." Somewhere near the door, the woman with the half-raised phone finally pressed record, though she'd missed the moment that mattered most and would only ever have the aftermath. Gerald's stillness, the low murmur spreading through the line of customers, and a very tall man in a torn jacket standing exactly where he'd been standing for 10 minutes, having never once needed to defend himself, because someone else had simply refused to let the lie stand unchallenged. It was only then, in the murmur that followed, that a woman near the counter, a longtime customer who apparently recognized him from somewhere, said his name out loud, followed a beat later by a title Gerald had somehow never bothered to learn in 19 years of watching this man walk into his branch twice a month. Dr. Renner, director of the intensive care unit at the hospital 11 blocks away, the man who had, as it happened, stabilized Gerald's own father after a cardiac arrest 3 years earlier, a fact neither of them had known until that exact moment, and which landed on Gerald with a second, quieter, more devastating weight than the first revelation had. He had been wrong about the man in front of him not once, but twice, in the span of 10 minutes, and both mistakes had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Nobody in that lobby cheered. That was the thing people would remember later, when they tried to describe what had happened, that there was no triumphant moment, no round of applause, nothing that felt like a movie ending. Marcus simply nodded once, the smallest possible acknowledgement, not to Gerald but to Claire, and Claire gave the faintest answering tilt of her head, and neither of them said a word to the other. Not yet, not there. Gerald stood at his own counter looking like a man who had aged 5 years in 5 minutes, and somewhere behind him a colleague quietly closed the folder he'd been holding since the beginning, as if putting it away could undo what had already been said out loud in front of a dozen strangers. Marcus and Claire ended up walking out of the branch within a minute of each other, and by pure coincidence, or maybe not entirely by coincidence, they reached the sidewalk at the same time, standing for a moment under the bank's stone awning while the late morning traffic moved past them, indifferent to what had just happened 20 feet away. "You didn't have to do that," Marcus said, and it wasn't quite gratitude in his voice. Not exactly, it was something closer to acknowledgement, one careful person recognizing another. "I know," Claire said. She didn't elaborate. She never really did. Marcus looked down at her, not the way people usually looked down at her, Not with the reflexive readjustment he'd watched 1,000 strangers make in his own life when someone unexpected turned out to matter, but with something closer to recognition, the specific quiet of a man realizing he was standing next to someone who understood, without being told, exactly what it cost to hold still while a room decided who you were. "I noticed you before he did," Marcus said. "Everyone in that room noticed him first. I noticed you." Claire almost smiled at that, the corner of her mouth moving in a way that suggested she didn't do it often, not for strangers. "Most people don't," she said. "That's usually the point." She opened her small leather notebook one more time, right there on the sidewalk, and wrote something quick, 3 or 4 words, the same clipped fragments she always used, and closed it before Marcus could see what she'd written. Then she said, "Dr. Renner," testing the title in her mouth like she was filing it away for later use, and he said, "Ms. Whitfield," in return, with the exact same careful wait, and that was all either of them offered by way of introduction. No handshake, no exchanged numbers. Just 2 people who had spent 10 minutes being wildly underestimated by the same man, walking in opposite directions down the same street, each of them a little less alone in it than they had been an hour before. Nobody in that bank had been watching the small woman signing papers in the corner. Nobody had needed to, until the exact moment it mattered most. And by then, she had already decided everything that was going to happen next. That's usually how it works. The people who take the least space in a room are so often the ones holding the most weight in it, and the mistake almost never announces itself in advance. It just waits, quietly, at a desk near the door, filling out paperwork, taking notes no one thinks to ask about, until the moment someone forces its hand. Gerald would remember, for years afterward, that he had made his decision about who deserved his suspicion in under 10 seconds, and that it had taken a woman he'd nearly refused to acknowledge exactly as long to finish undoing it. He would tell the story differently every time he told it, softening it a little more each time, the way people do with the moments that embarrass them most, until eventually the version he told himself bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened in that lobby on a quiet Tuesday morning. But the people who had stood there and watched it happen would remember it exactly as it was. A tall, silent man who never once needed to defend himself, and a small, unhurried woman who had simply refused to let a lie stand, and how very little space either of them had needed to take up in order to change everything. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting.